Hi there. Just
Yep.
starting.
Yep. You ever heard of Asgardia?
Hi there.
Hi.
Just
Yep.
starting.
Yep. Yes. You ever heard of a place Asgardia?
No.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your patience. A little bit late.
You have an echo. That was better.
Okay. Hey there. 18 June. Dis&datInformation. We're going to look a little bit at Michael Heinrich and Marx's fragment on machines from the Grundrisse. Now, why are we looking back at this? Well, yesterday and the day before that, we were looking at the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and its relationship to the Grundrisse, and of course, their relationship as rediscovered texts in the context of Marx's Capital and all of the different little machinations, the little diversions, Kautsky, Lenin, etc. Um, and of course, the meanderings of post-war Marxism. So if anything, these repeated versions of that history are, of course, a narrative that doesn't change that much, but I think we do need to be occasion-minded of it because, we come back to Lukács, the Frankfurt School, etc., and it's not really that we can ignore it because eventually you have to come back to it. You have to decide whether you're going to still read Habermas, whether um, the early portions of Pollock and the critical theory, Frankfurt, Frankfurt School critical theory are worth looking at. So today we're going to look at Heinrich's treatment of the fragment on machines. And I've included the fragment on machines and a video that audio coverage of that, so you don't have to listen to me yammer on about it. I've included at the end of today's thing, or at the bottom, are a couple of articles that also support some of these things. For example, the unmaking of Marx's Capital, Heinrich's attempt to eliminate Marx's crisis theory, which is a whole other thing, and it's being responded to in this particular context by Kleiman and Freeman, which is the other side of the value question, and is, for some folks, it might be a little too damn tedious, but it is an interesting question, not profoundly interesting, but one that does have a sort of a diversion or critique of, Heinrich's position as well. The fragment on the machines sort of fits in that, and Heinrich is building an argument, not unlike the claim I just made, or for that article that talks about eliminating crisis theory, which I don't think that you can really do, because crises and catastrophes do occur. It's just that building it into a consistent theory is the other side of the problem. So I'm going to start in a second on Heinrich's article, The Fragment on Machines, a Marxian misconception in the Grundrisse and its overcoming in Capital. So recall that the Grundrisse is a work that doesn't appear in Marx's lifetime, and it only occurs in the post-war period, or at least is paid more attention to, let's put it that way, in the post-war period. And of course, since Heinrich is one of those people who actually, because he's German, et cetera, that he's had a better chance to look at the archives and the yet unattended to components of the MIGA, that is the sort of the unfinished, as it were, or the incomplete elements of Marx. And one hopes that at some moment, from a translation point of view, that maybe AI will fix that. So anyway, I'm going to begin this in a second. I'll be back in a moment. Okay. The Grundrisse still belongs to the most beloved texts of Marxist interpreters. Some authors argue that the so-called fragment on machines is a central document for a Marxian theory of capitalist catastrophes, a kind of breakdown theory of capitalism, or at least a description of a process in which a new mode of production emerges, inaugurated by capitalism itself, but in contradiction with the logic of capital. In such considerations, the results of the fragment, hitherto called the fragment, are taken for granted. However, the results of this fragment on machines derive, on the one hand, from a one-sided conception of crisis in Marxist thinking since the early 1850s, and on the other hand, from some shortcomings in the conception of basic categories in the Grundrisse. In the years after the Grundrisse, Marx overcame both misconceptions. So in Capital Volume 1, when dealing with the production of relative surplus value, we can find an implicit critique of the fragment on machines. Now, ignoring Marx's theoretical development, as does Antonio Negri, when he states that the Grundrisse should be read for itself, one can easily neglect a discussion of the implicit self-critique of Marx. Reading the text for itself means accepting uncritically the results of the text. In order to discuss the Grundrisse productively today, we have to contextualize the text, not only in the development of Marxist thought. We also have to situate our reading of the Grundrisse in the development of the discussion about Marx in the 20th century, because this development has shaped many of the ways in which the Grundrisse was and still is read. Number one, the reception of the Grundrisse in the 20th century. Note, of course, that Grundrisse means foundation, or is translated as foundation. So that's important as well. When we discuss the work of a significant author, we always do so in a determinate historical situation, which provides us with specific problems and reservations. Certain things appear to us to be obvious, while others seem to be questionable or superannuated. Some of these evaluations would have appeared very differently 30 or 40 years earlier. In the case of Marx, furthermore, there is the fact that many texts that are today very important for the debate were not even published during his lifetime. His work has become accessible in its totality only slowly. Not only the respective historical content, but also the respective state of publication of his texts influenced the direction and the course of many subsequent debates. Now, even in the case of Capital, the text Capital, Marx could only publish the first volume. Engels published the second and third volumes after Marx's death with considerable editorial interventions. Only in the last years have Marx's original manuscripts for these volumes have been published in the context of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, that is the MEGA, the MEGA. Thus, it is only now, after more than 100 years, that we can identify Engels' editorial interventions and discuss their conceptual and substantial relevance. At the beginning of the 20th century, after Karl Kautsky, recall, Karl Kautsky, the Social Democrat, published the theories of surplus value between 1905 to 1910, it appeared as if all of Marx's critique of political economy was completely available, as the theories of surplus value were regarded as the fourth volume of Capital, dealing with the history of the theory, which Marx had planned. In the reading that was then prominent, Marx was regarded as the great socialist economist who had demonstrated the exploitation of the working class, the crises-prone nature of capitalism, and the inevitable transition to socialism, first in the Communist Manifesto, and then later on a broader foundation in the book Capital. Most Marxists celebrated these findings as the triumph of scientific socialism. Beginning in the 1920s, however, there was a strengthening of the critique of actual or supposed tendencies in Marx's theory of quote-unquote economism, determinism, and above all, objectivism. In this context, the publication of Marx's early works, particularly the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, were like a bombshell. Here, apparently, the broad philosophical and socio-theoretical background of Marx's economic analyses, his considerations of the human essence and alienation in capitalism became clear, as we've discussed for the last couple of days. The objectivism that has previously been so roundly criticized, along with the lack of the theory of the subject, could, so it seemed at least, be overcome on these foundations. This transformed reception was not a purely inner theoretical phenomenon, but the result of a determinate political reading, which in different ways was deployed against the tendencies towards petrification and dogmatism of official party Marxism. Fascism and Stalinism, however, made it impossible for the discussion that began in the early 1930s to develop in a significant sense. This occurred only in the 1960s, when the conditions of the debate had substantially changed. Above all, the reception of Marx's early writing had lost its almost automatically assured anti-dogmatic impulse. In the meantime, these texts had been integrated by the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy to a large extent. When, for example, Louis Althusser in 1965 criticized Marx's early writings as, quote-unquote, ideological and introduced the specific form of scientificity of capital, this was also a critique of this orthodoxy. However, his strongly argued position also earned him the accusation, precisely from the anti-orthodox side, of having banished the subject and social struggles from the theoretical discussion. The debates over the relation between early, that is, philosophical, and late economic theoretical Marx had multiplied, just as the political perspectives connected to the individual positions within these debates had. It was in this context that there really began, for the first time, a widespread reading of the Grundrisse, which enduringly influenced the terms and conditions of its interpretation. The Grundrisse, which was first published in 1939 to 41 in Moscow, was accorded only sporadic interest during the war, needless to say, and in the immediate post-war period. Even when the text was reprinted in the GDR, that is, East Germany, in 1953, the text did not initially have many readers. Now, this changed with the publication in 1968 of Roman Radulski's commentary on the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse was then discussed widely not only in Germany, but with the French translation of 1967 and the first English translation of 1973, the debate began in many other countries as well. The Grundrisse appeared to be the magic wand with which one could solve the problems in Marxist theory that had been discussed up until then. The contraposition of a young philosophical Marx and a mature economic theoretic Marx was seemingly lessened, but nevertheless found a mediating, connecting link in the Grundrisse. This text, the Grundrisse, made it clear that the mature Marx's economic writings were also based upon a developed philosophical foundation. What was lacking in the book Capital seemed to be present in the Grundrisse. Now, while Marx dealt with methodological questions in Capital, the text, almost only in the prefaces and afterwards, the problematic was raised continuously in the course of the presentation in the Grundrisse. There is also a much clearer reference to Hegel's philosophy in the Grundrisse. Something similar is the case with the question of subjectivity. Much more strongly than in Capital, labor is conceptualized as the subjective counterpoint to capital. Additionally, the six-book plan that Marx envisaged as he wrote the Grundrisse, that is, capital, landed property, wage labor, state, international trade, and the world market, made clear that the independent object of investigation was much broader than that treated by Marx in the book Capital. Finally, the Grundrisse seemed to be a supplement to the book Capital, since here a series of themes were discussed that received no corresponding treatment in the presentation of the book Capital. The most well-known of these themes occurs in the Grundrisse under the headings of, quote, forms that precede capitalist production, unquote, and in that fragment on machines that was discussed very early in Italian workerism, apparismo. The Grundrisse thus seemed to offer something for everybody. Now, today, the discussion of Marx is not conceivable without the Grundrisse. Indeed, the Grundrisse are a fascinating work, and reading them is a singular intellectual adventure. As if we were looking over his shoulder, we can observe Marx in the process of his analysis and the formation of his theory. The grasp of the material is much freer and less regimented than in Capital. All too often, however, this understandable fascination leads to an uncritical enthusiasm. Darn that humanism. The Grundrisse and number two, the Grundrisse and the development of Marx's theory. If the Grundrisse are posited simply as a supplement besides Marx's book Capital, then the inner theoretical process of development of Marx's critique of political economy and the transitory character of the Grundrisse are ignored. Let us recall very briefly this development. Following the theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology, Marx's work in 1845-6 issued in a fundamental critique of any approach to economic theory centered on human species being and alienation. We tried to address that in the last couple of days. Nevertheless, at that stage, Marx did not have very much that he could put in the place of these conceptions. Positively, the German ideology offered above all a turn to the empirical. Again and again, Marx and Engels stressed that that positive science, the registration of the empirical state of affairs and relations, needed to take the place of philosophical speculation. Against this background, Marx accepted the political economy of Ricardo and the class theory of French historians as substantially correct descriptions of capitalist reality. In his engagement with Proudhon in The Poverty of Philosophy of 1847, Marx continually praised Ricardo in the highest terms for the acuity of his analysis. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx referred without hesitation to the bourgeois class analysis that can be found in French historians such as Guizot or Thierry in their analysis of the French Revolution. The only thing that he found in Ricardo to criticize at this point in time was his conception that capitalism was not an historically determinate mode of production, but rather an eternal, quasi-natural one. Something similar is the case for class theory. Marx did not claim that he had discovered the existence of classes and the class struggle, but rather that the class struggle must ultimately lead to a classless society. And this is the whole teleological kind of question, etc. In the second half of the 1840s, we find in Marx a critical deployment of the given bourgeois political economy and class theory, but still, no fundamental critique of the categories of political economy. And this categorical thing is something that still remains today as a point of an entry point for discussion or interpretation. This critique was developed only after Marx's forced emigration to London, here in the heart of the capitalist world system, within the 300 miles of Dover. In that period, and with the help of the enormous stock of books of the British Museum, Marx started his economic studies again from the very beginning, as he himself emphasized in the 1859 preface to the uh, to the critique of political economy. Now, only now did he begin to develop a critique of the categories as well. Initially, Marx criticized Ricardo's theory of money and rent. As he progressed, the critique became increasingly fundamental. When Marx wrote the introduction in 1857 and thus began the Grundrisse, this was not only the beginning of a development of his critique of economics that would eventually lead to the book Capital, it was also, and above all, an inventory taking of what he had achieved in terms of theoretical insights in the previous years. Now, the attempt to set down these insights in a coherent way, however, still entailed a daunting process of research, during which Marx came up against more than merely one theoretical lacuna, or gap, or whatever is missing. When Marx began the Grundrisse, he already had a mass of material for his planned economic work, but was still far from a finished concept. The Grundrisse, in fact, has no genuine beginning. A critique of Daimon, a student of Proudhon, who wanted to overcome capitalism by means of the monetary system, gee, where we've heard that before, indescribably or indiscernibly passes over into an engagement with the categorical foundations that are necessary for such critique. Here we can clearly see that Marx still had had serious difficulties with the categories of value, money, and exchange. A close reading of the chapter on money clearly shows that it is not yet a unitary attempt at presentation, but rather a superimposition of numerous continuously renewed attempts at presentation. That Marx, despite these unsolved problems, did not fall back into yet another research process was due to an external motive. That is the world economic crisis that commenced in 1857, the panic, et cetera, et cetera. Marx had been impatiently waiting for years for such a crisis, anticipating that violent economic tremors and revolutionary revolts would follow in its wake. His book had been supposed to provide support for the revolutionary movement, and now Marx feared that he would be too late. During his work on the Grundrisse, Marx made enormous advances in his knowledge. His analysis, however, also had significant deficiencies, which many enthusiastic readings do not seem to discern. Marx himself wrote that this manuscript is a real hodgepodge, much of it intended for much later sections. He did not merely mean the ordering of the material, the large number of digressions and intimations. The order of the presented categories is itself the bearer of a determinate yield of information. It shows the connections of these categories, the interconnection that exists between them. Categories like the commodity, money, capital, wage labor, and so forth are theoretical expressions of social relations in a developed capitalist society. These relations not only appear simultaneously, they mutually presuppose each other in social reality. Only theoretical analysis allows one to distinguish between simple and complex categories and to express the conceptual theoretical connection between the categories. When the manuscript's coherence breaks down, however, it is precisely this conceptual connection between or among the individual categories that is not yet clearly grasped. That means that there are still not insignificant deficiencies, that is, significant deficiencies, in the conceptual fixing of these categories. Now, we will discuss some of these deficiencies in the next section. The fact that Marx removed some of these deficiencies in the 1860s does not mean, however, that there might be a linear, progressive development, a continuous refinement from the Grundrisse to the book Capital. Such an idea, however, guided the editors of the MEGA, the MEGA, in the 1970s and 80s, who characterized the Grundrisse, the manuscripts of 1961 to 2, that is MEGA 2, 3.1 to 3.6, and the manuscripts of 1863 to 5, MEGA 2, 4.1 to 4.2. I think this is a typo, and it should be the manuscripts of 1861 to 62. Anyway, as the three drafts of Capital, thus implying that Capital, by which he meant the 3-volume work edited by Engels, was the goal towards which a developmental process moved, beginning precisely with the Grundrisse. Besides the improvement of the presentation and the overcoming of theoretical deficiencies, however, we can also observe an opposed tendency in this development. Marx himself spoke often of popularization of his presentation. A first popularization can be observed in the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. A second attempt at popularization consists in the second edition of Capital, Volume 1. This is the same second edition that we see referred to in the 2024 translation, the new translation of Capital, Volume 1. These popularizations have their price. Determinate conceptual contexts are sometimes obscured. Other connections no longer appear in the book Capital, such as, for example, the transition from money to capital. Thus, Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt in particular have understood this development from the Grundrisse to the book Capital not as an improvement, let alone a refinement of the presentation, but rather as a tale of decline away from an originally very strongly composed presentation. Both positions, that is, the idea of a continuous refinement, as well as that of a constant theoretical regress, seem nevertheless to be inadequate. This is not only because both improvement as well as deterioration can be observed, but above all, because in this way we neglect that the path from the Grundrisse to the book Capital witnesses not only transformations of individual aspects, but also of the fundamental conceptual questions. The 6-book plan, as well as the concept of capital in general, Marx develops both during his work on the Grundrisse and redeploys them in the manuscripts of 1861-3 is given up. With Capital, the book Capital, for which the manuscripts of 1863-5 are the first and not the third draft, Marx develops a new theoretical frame of reference for which the distinction between individual capital and social total capital is decisive. Indeed, we have to distinguish between two different projects. Critique of Political Economy in 6 books, for which 2 drafts exist, that is, the Grundrisse and the manuscript of 1861-63, and Capital in 4 books, with 3 drafts, manuscripts of 1863-5, manuscripts of 1866-71, including the first edition of Capital Volume 1, and finally, the manuscripts of 1871-81. Now, section 3, Marx's argument in the fragment on the machines and its errors. This is the important sort of point for Heinrich. At the beginning of the manuscript of the Grundrisse, Marx does not yet operate on the basis of developed value theoretic considerations. Rather, he initially attempts to determine the status of money within commodity circulation. In particular, he has still not clarified the distinction between, as we have been plowing through, abstract and concrete labor, a configuration that he describes in the book Capital as the crucial point of the understanding of political economy, and in a letter to Engels of 8 January 1868 as the, quote, whole secret of the critical conception, unquote. The clear fixing of the distinction between abstract labor and concrete labor, with which Marx completely or finally broke with Ricardo's value theory, occurred only in the 1859 contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Indeed, Marx distinguishes also in the Grundrisse clearly between use value and value, but not yet as clearly between exchange value and value. He does this only in the second edition of Capital Volume 1. You can see that right with the translation. When he speaks of value determining labor time, it is a case, as in Smith and Ricardo, of merely a labor sans phrase, which does not prevent the determinations of abstract labor and concrete labor from being confused. The analysis of the capitalist production process as a unity of labor and valorization processes occurs only in preliminary hypotheses. Marx thus had difficulties to hold on to the form determination of constant capital, so he frequently went back to the question of how is it possible that labor can both add new value, but also carry over the value of the utilized means of production onto the product. The back and forth of Marx's attempt at explanation, now with quote unquote form and quote unquote substance of labor, form of labor and substance of labor, now with quality and quantity of labor, is extensively analyzed in a volume published by the PEM, the project group, the Entwicklung des Marxischen Systems. As this is a succeeding group, I think, to the new reading. As Marx still had problems with the concept of constant capital, he saw the actual capitalist form determination of the means of labor only in the category of capital fixe, capital fixe, that is, of a form determination that contains the means of labor only in circulation. Thus, the much discussed fragment on machines occurs in the section on the capitalist circulation process, although problems are treated that belong to the analysis of the capitalist production process. So there's a kind of department 1 and 2 issue that gets cleared up. Marx initially maintains that the means of labor in the capitalist production process passes through a series of metamorphoses until it ends up as the machine, or rather as an automatic system or machinery. Now here, the activity of the worker is also transformed. It is determined and governed in every respect by the movement of the machinery, not vice versa. This entire development, Marx argues, is not a matter of chance for capital, but the historical transformation of the traditional means of labor as handed down from the past into a form adequate to capital. The accumulation of knowledge and skill of the general productive forces of the social mind is thus absorbed in capital as opposed to labor, and hence appears as a property of capital, more precisely of fixed capital, to the extent that it enters into the production process as a means of production in the strict sense. So that this is, technology is, combined with the manual in machinery and fixed capital. Shortly afterwards, Marx summarizes thus, quote, hence, the full development of capital only takes place, or capital is only posited the mode of production corresponding to it, when the means of labor is not merely formally determined as fixed capital, but is superseded in its immediate form, and fixed capital confronts labor within the production process as machinery. You show up to work, there's a machine, you better read the damn manual, etc. The entire production process then appears no longer as subsumed under the immediate skill of the worker, but as technological application of science. Capital thus tends to impart a scientific character to production. And immediate labor is reduced to a mere moment of this process, close quote. Now, in the 19th century, a contemporary observer could not fail to note that machinery had an increasing significance in capitalist production, that the application of science was increasing, and that the individual worker played an ever smaller role. The fact that Marx here notes these developments is no particular analytical achievement. Such an achievement could only consist in the ordering and explanation of the process. Marx treats these developments as a process that capital necessarily produced. That is, capital posits the mode of production corresponding to it. Why, however, is the employment of machinery and the increasingly scientific nature of production adequate for capital? Marx's answer is vague. In the first cited passage, he argues that the general productive forces of the social mind are absorbed by capital. In the second citation, he emphasizes that the scientific production process is no longer subsumed under the immediate skill of the worker. In other words, on the basis of the capitalist appropriation of socially produced knowledge, the power of capital over labor increases. Capital increasingly becomes independent from individual workers and their skills. This increasing power is a positive effect for capital. The goal of capital, however, is the production of surplus value. If we wish to show that the developments named by Marx represent the mode of production corresponding to capital, we must refer to the production of surplus value. In this citation, however, Marx is still a long way from this, since he does not have an adequate concept of the production of relative surplus value. This means that he can deal with the increasing application of machinery and the growing scientific nature of production only as an empirically noticeable tendency, and claim that they are a development that is adequate for capital. He cannot yet, however, justify them as this adequate development. Now, instead of providing such a justification, he emphasizes an apparent contradiction taken from the empirical evidence. Quote, in the same measure as labor time, the simple quantity of labor is posited by capital as the sole determinant of value. Intermediate labor and its quantity disappear as the determining principle of production, of the creation of use values. It is reduced both quantitatively in that its proportion declines, and qualitatively though still indispensable, becomes a subaltern moment in comparison to general scientific work, close quote. Marx then immediately draws the following far-reaching conclusion, quote, thus capital works to dissolve itself as the form which dominates production. This surprising result is not further justified at this stage. Instead, Marx deals with the problem of the way in which capital fixe, contributes to the value of the produced product, in order to be able to oppose Lauderdale's conception that capital fixe is a source of value that is independent from labor time. Now, only a few pages later, he comes back to this contradiction. He holds that the presuppositions of the capital relation is the sheer volume of immediate labor time, the quantity of labor employed, as the decisive factor in the production of wealth. Now, this presupposition, however, is undermined by the development of industry itself. Quote, but in the degree in which large-scale industry develops, the creation of real wealth becomes less dependent on labor time and the quantity of labor employed than upon the power of agents set in motion during labor time. So he's making a structural argument here, and one at scale. However, if immediate labor time plays an ever smaller role, what does the worker still do in the process of production? Quote, labor no longer appears so much as included in the production process, but rather man relates himself to that process as overseer and regulator. He stands beside the production process rather than being its main agent. Close quote. Here, it's no longer a case of immediate labor performed by man himself, but rather of the appropriation of his own general productive power, on the basis of which Marx then draws an extremely far-reaching conclusion. Quote, as soon as labor in its immediate form has ceased to be the great source of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure. And therefore, exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. The surplus labor of the masses has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labor of a few has ceased to be the condition for the development of the general powers of the human mind. As a result, production based on exchange value collapses, close quote. Now, while these sentences are often cited, it's worthwhile to look more closely at whether and how Marx justifies them. Marx's starting point is the empirically noticeable tendency that the use of machines and the increasing scientific dimension of production steadily advance in the capitalist mode of production. This unconventional observation then serves him as the foundation of deductions that are based upon each other. So, A, Marx sees immediate labor increasingly disappearing from the production process, from which should then follow B, that immediate labor is no longer the great source of wealth. Rather, this is increasingly constituted by science or general social knowledge, the general intellect. C, in this case, labor time is no longer the measure of wealth. D, which should have been the consequence that capitalist production, that is, production based upon exchange value, collapses. Now, if we consider carefully these deductions in detail, we see that the lacking distinction between concrete useful labor, which produces use values, and abstract human labor, which is represented in value, has decisive consequences. So, regarding A, Marx extrapolates limitlessly the empirical observation of the progressive deployment of machinery. It would, however, be necessary first to explain whether or not there really are no limits in the capitalist production process for the replacement of that immediate labor by machines. Now, if we consider only concrete useful labor, then there does indeed appear to be no limit for the increase in productivity by means of the increasing deployment of machinery, although the period of time in which this occurs remains an open question. We should bear in mind, however, that it is a case of a capitalist production process, for there is certainly a limit to the employment of machinery. The machinery used in a capitalist way is itself a value object, which yields the average expenditure of value to the produced product. If a given machine produces 10,000 pieces before it is worn out, then the machine yields 1/10,000th of its value to the individual product. Note, that we'll get to depreciation and amortization at some point. As Marx discusses extensively in the second section of the 15th chapter of the book Capital, Volume 1, the employment of machinery in the capitalist production process is only worthwhile if the production costs of the product are reduced. And that only occurs when the value yield of the machine to the product is lower than the reduction of costs that occurs due to the reduced expenditure of living labor. If the employment of machines saves an hour in the production of a piece, then the capitalist saves the wage for this 1 hour. If the value yield of the machine to the product is higher than the wage for an hour, then the capitalist will not employ the machine, since the machine may make labor more productive, but nevertheless raise production costs. Only when the value yield of the machine is less than the saved wage costs is the machine employed. Now, let me break here for a second and say, well, this is an oversimplification perhaps, but hopefully you can see this kind of logic at work, and that it is obviously going to be much more complicated. So regarding B, it is unclear what Marx means here by wealth, and this is a bigger issue. If it is material wealth, namely the mass of use values, then immediate labor would never be the great source of wealth, as besides concrete useful labor, the natural productive forces, like, for example, field or land fertility, and the productive forces created by humans would be equally great sources of wealth. However, if Marx means here that the social form of wealth in capitalist societies, that is, the value of the immense accumulation of commodities, then this value is the representation of abstract human labor, which has produced the commodities. Here, it's not important which part of this abstract human labor is an expression of the quote-unquote immediate labor that was expended in the last production process, and which part is an expression of the labor objectified in the machines, the value of which is carried over to the product. So even if an increasingly larger part of the product's value is traced back to the value transfer made by the used machines, abstract labor remains the substance of value. Now, regarding C, if, however, abstract labor remains the substance of value, then labor time also remains the immanent measure of it. even if the immediate labor time in production plays an increasingly reduced role. Immediate labor time was, at any rate, never the measure of value. Immediate labor time is that quantity of concrete labor that is expended by an individual producer. However, the individual expenditure of concrete labor time does not form value. Rather, value is formed by that quantity of abstract human labor that results only from the average social relations. So you see there's kind of increasing abstraction going on. Regarding D, if labor time remains the immanent measure of value, then the argument given by Marx for his last deduction, the collapse of production based upon exchange value, is no longer valid either. Indeed, with this last deduction, which is problematic, it remained completely unclear from the outset how the difficulties of measuring value, insofar as it's supposed to occur, should then lead immediately to the collapse of capitalist production. So, above all, the weakness of this last deduction D is clear, and it's amazing that Marx himself did not notice how weak the argument is. Now, an explanation for this lies in the conception of crisis with which he operated before the drafting of the Grundrisse. The Communist Manifesto claimed that the commercial crises by their periodic return put on its trial each time more threateningly the existence of the entire bourgeois society, close quote. Some years later, Marx and Engels then claimed a close connection between crisis and revolution. Quote, a new revolution is possible only in the consequence of a new crisis. It is, however, just as certain as this crisis, close quote, that Marx, while composing the manuscript of the Grundrisse, saw in crisis not only the catalyst of a political process, but also the beginnings of an economic collapse, is clear from an early draft plan. There he writes, crises, dissolution of the mode of production and form of society based upon exchange value. At the beginning of his work on the Grundrisse, Marx was convinced that the crisis would lead to the dissolution of the capitalist mode of production, and that in the course of its development, this mode of production would finally collapse. Now, as the first great crisis of the world market had begun that would lead to the deluge, he had only to sketch out the mechanism that formed the basis of this process. We know, however, that something very different occurred. Although the first genuine crisis of the world market occurred in 1857-8, it was neither a catalyst of revolutionary unrest, nor did it announce the collapse of production based on exchange value. On the contrary, the crisis was quickly over, and capitalist production emerged from it strengthened. Now, Marx learned this lesson thoroughly and never forgot it. When Danielson pressured him to finish Capital in the late 1870s, Marx replied to him that he couldn't finish Capital, the book, before the current crisis reached its high point, because it showed entirely new phenomena that he still had to comprehend theoretically. Nothing is left of any ideas of collapse, or even his fear during the composition of the Grundrisse that he would be too late with his book. But I think this is the subject of, looking at more correspondence, etc. Quenet's riddle and its solution, section 4, the phenomena that Marx analyzed in the Grundrisse in relation to capital fixe, appear in the book Capital, Volume 1, in different places as a component part of the investigation of the production of relative surplus value, a category that was only present in a rudimentary form in the Grundrisse, but which is developed in the book Capital on the basis of a precise distinction between concrete useful labor and abstract human labor, and between constant and variable capital, as well as the comprehension of the capitalist production process as a unity of the labor process and the valorization process. Developments of productive power are now not only empirically or factually included, but grasped as the systematic methods of the production of relative surplus value, in which consists the fundamental possibility of an increase in productive power in the cooperation of the individual labor powers the division of labor, analyzed paradigmatically in light of manufacture, and the employment of machinery, paradigmatically in large-scale industry. So you have three levels there. On all three levels, the social productive power of labor appears as the productive power of capital, and the intellectual potentialities of the material process of production appear to the workers as the property of another and as a power which rules over him. Now, the problem is, however, this is not the case in the same way on all three levels. So, quote, this process of separation starts in simple cooperation where the capitalist represents to the individual workers the unity and the will of the whole body of social labor. Teamwork. It is developed in manufacture, which mutilates the worker, turning him into a fragment of himself. Recall all the safety issues and then child labor, etc. It is completed in large-scale industry, which makes science a potentiality for production, which is distinct from labor, and presses it into the service of capital. Close quote. Marx then summarizes in his analysis of machinery and large-scale industry in chapter 15. Quote, every kind of capitalist production, insofar as it's not only a labor process, but also capital's process of valorization, has this in common. But it is not the worker who employs the conditions of his work, but rather the reverse. The conditions of work employ the worker. Now, see, we've already seen an abstraction here, right? However, it is only with the coming of machinery that this inversion first acquires a technical and palpable reality. Owing to its conversion into an automaton, the instrument of labor confronts the worker during the labor process in the shape of capital, dead labor, which dominates and soaks up living labor power. The separation of the intellectual faculties of the production process from manual labor and the transformation of such faculties into powers exercised by capital over labor is, as we've already shown, finally completed by large-scale industry erected on the foundation of machinery. That's a long sentence that sort of hopefully describes this, division of labor or economy of scale. The special skill of each individual machine operator, who has now been deprived of all significance, vanishes as an infinitesimal quantity in the face of science, the gigantic natural forces, and the mass of social labor embodied in the system of machinery. So, yes, there is a discussion of congealment, but it is talking about it not as something reified, but rather something, more abstract. By analyzing close quote, by analyzing changes in the production process in the context of the production of relative surplus value, that is, an increase in productive power leads to a reduction of the value of labor power and thus the necessary labor time, so that surplus labor time correspondingly increases. Marx could not merely claim the necessity of this development, as in the Grundrisse, but also justify it. It also became clear to him that the separation of the intellectual potentialities of the production process from the workers is a tendency that is imminent to all capitalist production. This process found a high point in machine production, but not a tipping point that put capitalist production into question. That the detailed skills of the individual worker become minute besides the employment of science, and thus beside the general intellect, does not threaten value production. This state of affairs rather alters the concept of the productive worker, as is rather parenthetically noted in chapter 16. In the book Capital, Marx studies the same developments as those examined in the fragment on machines. Nowhere, however, does he claim that abstract labor is no longer the substance of value, or that labor as a measure of value is placed into question for good reason. The value dimension now comes into play on an entirely different level. In the treatment of the concept of relative surplus value in chapter 12, Marx speaks of the riddle with which one of the founders of political economy, Quenet, had tormented his opponents and for which they owed him an answer, namely the fact that, on the one hand, capitalists were only interested in exchange value, but that, on the other hand, they constantly sought to lower the exchange value of their products. Marx also could not provide an answer to this riddle in the Grundrisse. There, he had effectively named the contradiction nominated by Quenet. But rather than resolving it, he had comprehended it as a contradiction of capital by striving to reduce labor time to a minimum, while on the other hand, positing labor time as the sole measure and source of wealth. Capital itself is a contradiction in process. In the Grundrisse, Marx ascribed to this contradiction a potential to overthrow the capitalist mode of production. In the book Capital, against the background of the analysis of the production of relative surplus value, this contradiction is resolved. That is, the capitalist is not interested in the absolute value of the commodity, but rather merely in surplus value contained within it and able to be realized by means of sale. That is Department 2, right? Distribution, consumption. And since the same process both cheapens commodities and augments the surplus value contained in them, we have here the solution of the following riddle. Why does the capitalist, whose sole concern is to produce exchange value, continually strive to bring down the exchange value of commodities? So the contradiction that had so astounded Marx in 1857-8 in the Grundrisse that he had immediately seen the collapse of all production based on exchange value is reduced in Capital, the book Capital, in 1867 to a riddle from the history of the theory, and one which has a simple solution. Those interpreters who have stopped at the Grundrisse have not accompanied Marx in these decisive theoretical advances. So the point, Heinrich's complaint here, if it is a complaint, is that obviously people have treated the Grundrisse too autonomously, didn't see it in the context of a thing that the fragment of the on machines does get incorporated. It's not included in the next edition of Capital because Marx has sort of moved on from there because he sort of figured out that, okay, this is a bad idea that I had, that this value thing was kind of one-dimensional, and he begins to accept the idea in those subsequent years of a kind of nuanced version of this that is better defined by questions of the difference between relative and absolute surplus value, the necessity for scale, the further division, but on the other hand, the further connection of Department 1 and Department 2, which he doesn't mention in Volume 1, but, is really important to Volume 2, that, it's sort of there. He sort of works this out. And unfortunately, some writers have, sort of treated it at sort of face value. And because they'd found it as a sort of undealt with thing, that, the people had to sort of cogitate on it. And while they privileged the kind of humanist approach that the Grundrisse might explain further, they sometimes don't note that it is transcended or improved upon or adapted or modified by Marx in subsequent writing. And to see all this in the issue of the humanist treatment of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 is often, privileged in the way that, you see, oh, well, it must be more authentic because Marx was younger and blah, blah, blah. You sort of have to see the whole thing. You have to see, that Hegelianism doesn't disappear, but rather becomes refined and defined better in terms of dialectic in later writings. So that's kind of, all of this yammering here is to at least convince you that movement is occurring, that exchange value is still a kind of important idea, that use value doesn't change that much. It is simply this transformation process that is changing within the context of scale, division of labor, and scale, or technological transformation, the displacement of immediate labor by something more abstract. And of course, the point is that Marx is thinking more abstractly. He knows how things get made. What he's worried about are more abstract relations, which is why the commodity is used. The commodity helps to accommodate or assimilate or totalize capital, helps to explain capital in those kinds of ways. But it doesn't do it in a simple moment. Rather, it's all of these things at the same time. So if anything, Heinrich's value form questions are of a different type by comparison. So maybe you do or don't agree with me on this. I've reached the end of my yammering time on this. Let me point out that I've included a video reading of the fragment on machines by Marx, the Grundrisse. It's just a portion of the Grundrisse, but I included a video of it. So you can listen to this text read out. That is, machine presupposes a mass of workers. Capital, which consumes itself in the production process, or fixed capital, is the means of production in the strict sense. In a broader sense, the entire production process and each of its moments, such as circulation, Department 2, as regards its material side, is only a means of production for capital, for which value alone is the end in itself. Everything is right there. And then he distinguishes between physicality and not so physical, and all the whole structure of his subsequent argument being made in Capital is sort of there in the Grundrisse. You just have to sort of look for it, but you don't isolate it out by saying, well, this was, is purer, or that, he doesn't understand exchange, or et cetera, et cetera. All of those ideas are right there. They are more elemental. Marx is beginning to see the whole question of categories in a elemental, but then a gathering sort of way. So Marx's logic is being augmented at this particular moment in time. So anyway, that's that. And you can listen to that on the video. And then I included at the end links to other Heinrich things. So hopefully we've cleared up the Marxian misconception of the fragment on machines today. You can see that it gets a little crazier when you contrast other versions of the value question, which in and of itself becomes an entire divergence in the subsequent post-war decades. That is, the Kleiman Freeman on these value questions, and you have to sort of decide whether you are or aren't going to agree with their particular position on this. And it is fairly important because it is what the fragment describes and what we were just talking about, that you couldn't rely in terms of an earlier set of writings on the hopes or inevitability of crises, the teleology of the sort of a deterministic thing on when crisis and catastrophe is going to occur, because maybe it won't happen. And that's kind of what Marx is trying to deal with, is that, well, we did have this massive economic problem, but it got fixed for X number of reasons. And you want to go, Marx goes, well, I don't know how to deal with this. Or that he's trying to think about, in what ways can we deal with this relative to, Western Europe? And so many of these issues are churning about in his head because he's got colonialism operating at the same time, a very serious set of colonialism, the triangle trade, all these other things that are there. And he needs to write about them. And they aren't as crisis oriented, although they are part of the crisis. And they do have catastrophes, certainly. But also Marx has a certain expectation about how technology might get us out of this, that things happen that allow capitalism to continue and not, collapse, as they say. So that's kind of at work. And I included some other things, correcting interpretations. This one is on money and credit, which remains still issues that we see in monetary theory or modern money theory. And then, of course, beyond money, commodities, and the state, this is sort of the underlying element in the introduction to the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. And if you've been, paying attention to this, it is a series of adjustments that, because of the recession, Heinrich is sort of trying to adjust to as well in terms of the interpretation. And so ultimately, the biography, Heinrich's biography, it sort of has, sort of adjustments being made to it. And his subsequent writing reveals that. He goes through, these extended things about value form that, on the one hand, help explain this kind of disjuncture, if you will, that we've just described, but also with the current political situation. And so I included a video on the so-called unwritten capital. That is one of many different pieces that either is a good or a bad thing, depending on interpreters, on how you move the entire project forward. This is no different than the Kohei Saito's approach to eco-socialism, predicated on one or two different translation differences. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on there. So I've reached the end of my time. I'm going to stop share and move to